Hi, 7th and 8th. We are doing a brand new section of poetry today. I'm excited about it. We've talked about this kind of thing repeatedly throughout our poetry book. It's really hard to teach the elements of poetry one at a time without referring to several of them that we haven't even studied yet. So occasionally I'll say, hey, this is imagery, this is the speaker, this is diction, even though we haven't quite got to that section yet, because it's really hard to teach poetry without all those elements thrown in. But today we are going to start with a brand new element of poetry, and it is called imagery. Imagery is the elements in the poem that spark the senses. So when we see the picture that is being presented to us through the author's words, when we can hear, usually with onomatopoeia, we can hear the sounds that the author is trying to convey. When they say the dog barks at midnight, we can hear the bark in the word bark. When the imagery in the poem is so strong that we can actually smell the roses or smell the honey as it's being dripped onto the bread, sorry. When we can smell the fresh cut grass on the lawn, that's the way we can smell the words, even though we're just reading them off a piece of paper, using our imagination. Taste is also really important. When the author is describing some kind of food that melts on the tongue, when like sugar kind of melts, or chocolate, the creaminess just swirls around in your mouth, and we can taste that using our imagination. And then, of course, touch. We just read a beautiful poem called The Gift, which is all about a little boy that had a splinter in his hand, and then he, in turn, took the splinter out of his wife's hand when he was an adult. And we can almost feel the scraping of the knife as it scrapes away the skin so that the father can get to the splinter. We understand what it feels like to have a splinter, and so we can kind of relate to that. We use our imagination to understand what the author is speaking of. And so this is imagery. This is using our senses, our five senses, to spark an image in our head, an idea in our head of what the author is talking about. And that is really important for an author to try to reach out to us that way, because it makes their words seem more real to us. And that is really the whole point, because my favorite explanation of what literature is by Lawrence Perrine is literature is all about shared experience. If we can see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, touch it, we are sharing that experience, even though we're just reading words on a page. Okay, this poem is a little more complex than most of the poems that we've already read, and that's okay. We're going to take it through little bit by little bit. We're going to understand it. We're going to pull it apart, and then we're going to put it all back together and read it in a way that we can truly understand and embrace what he is saying in this poem. Now, I'm not saying this is the hardest poem we've ever read. It's not. But you have gone through some very difficult poems before, and there's no reason you can't do it again. Remember when we read My Last Duchess? That could be a very complex poem. There were words in there that you've never heard of, people refer to that you've never seen in history or read about in history. So we've done this before. We've read complex poems. Now we're going to continue on. Remember, to truly understand a poem, you only have to read it really 3 times through to really get the feel of it. The first time is just to get your feet wet, just to get the feel of the poem. The second time, you're tearing it apart. You're looking at every single pore in the skin of that poem. You're digging deeper. You're going in with instruments. You're pulling things out and looking at them and then putting them back in. And then that third time, you already know what the poem's about. And now you can allow the rhythm, the feeling, the senses, the imagery to come in and really make this poem sing for you. Okay, so let's go through My Native Land by Sir Walter Scott. He was a Scottish poet, obviously, and he wrote several novels that were really, really popular during his day, and that would have been during our period just before the Civil War, so in the 1850s and 60s. And they were very, very popular in the United States among the people who lived specifically in the South, because a lot of people in the South were trying to replicate the ideas of feudalism. There we go. Lost it. Feudalism. And so he wrote about feudalism, and they kind of embraced his writing as a result of that. So he was popular both in the United States and in Europe. But here we go. Let's read My Native Land by Sir Walter Scott. Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, This is my own, my native land, whose heart hath never within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand. If such there breathe, go, mark him well. For him no minstrel raptures swell. High though his titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth as wish can claim, despite those titles, power and pelf, the wretched concentred all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Okay, now let's take a look at the notes really quick. Sorry, my nose itching today. Let's look at the notes really quickly. And by the way, this picture that you see on your slide is Sir Walter Scott's house. That's his home. So he had a beautiful, beautiful place in Scotland. But let's look at what he says here. Sir Walter Scott uses diction, carefully selected and arranged words. We know about diction, we studied it, to describe the difference between a man who loves his homeland and one who is indifferent. Someone who's indifferent means they don't care. It doesn't matter to them. The patriotic man who has been away from home isn't just homesick, his heart burns. He's yearning for his home. He doesn't just visit other lands, he wanders on foreign shores. You see how he's using diction? It's not just, I'm homesick. No, my heart's burning for my foreign land. I'm not just visiting another place, I'm wandering on foreign shores. Like he doesn't really belong there and he just wants to find his pathway home. When he hears a folk song from home, he's lifted up. As for the man who doesn't care, he is con-centered or self-centered. And the people of the land he is apathetic to will be just as cold and uncaring to him. Okay, so we're using diction here, but with this use of diction, we're also getting an imagery. We're getting the sight. We're getting the feeling of what it feels like to be someone who doesn't care about their homeland, who has gone on to a foreign land and doesn't seem to have any kind of feeling for their home. Okay, now let's look at this other note. It says, even when people move from their home country to another nation, they take their language, food, and customs with them. That's really common. It's stuff you grew up with, and that is a little taste of home. You bring it with you. We had missionaries from our church years and years and years ago. We're talking 25, 30 years ago. Leave and go to Portugal. The husband was part Portuguese. His father was Portuguese. And so they were going to go to Portugal and they were going to start a church there. When people asked them, what do you miss the most about living in the United States? The response was Mexican food, because they had met in California. She was actually from California. He was born in California, even though his father was Portuguese. And they grew up on California and Mexican cuisine. And then when they got to Portugal, they discovered that the people of Portugal don't eat anything like that. Their primary diet is fish. Also, olives and olive oil is used. Everything is really more on the seafood side because Portugal is mostly coast. And then they live right next to Spain, which is Europe. So you're not going to see a lot of Mexican food. Mexican food and Spanish food are very, very different foods. So when they would get hungry, so hungry for Mexican food from California, And so when they came home on furlough, that's what they called vacations for missionaries. That's the first thing they would do. They would just gorge themselves on Mexican food. They would gorge themselves on California cuisine because that's really what they missed the most. And even sometimes it was kind of funny. People would even send them care packages of like Mexican food that they could assemble for themselves. It's kind of funny. But we when people move from their homeland and they go to another place, they do bring some of the customs and their food with them. And of course, they bring their language with them. You don't move, for instance, if I decided to move to France or to Germany, I'm not going to give up speaking English, but I do have to learn the language of my new country if I'm planning to go there. You don't just forget your original language, your original mother tongue. So people take things with them as they go from culture to culture. And every culture has been a borrowing culture, which means when new people come in and they show, hey, this is from my home culture, and people will look at it and they go, that's kind of cool. I want to do that too. And they will borrow some of the language and some of the food and some of the customs from other cultures, and we borrow and we share. It's very different idea of a sharing culture versus this new idea, and it is brand new. It's only been around for the past couple of decades. This idea of you're not borrowing culture, you're actually trying to take that culture over, or you're trying to and there's a specific word for it that I'm losing right now. You're actually trying to bring that culture to yourself, like you're not paying attention to what it really meant to the original person with that culture, like you're trying to take it over. That is a really new idea. Before this, it was all about the borrowing. Okay, so when I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, and I grew up on, food that my parents brought with them from New Jersey. So very Eastern kind of food, East Coast kind of food, not Eastern. And so when we first moved to Yuma in the middle of this desert, my mom would occasionally make chili, but it was very different from the chili that people in Yuma ate. For one thing, my mom put corn in her chili, which everybody else was looking at her like, what's that about? And rice. Rice was in the chili. It wasn't very great chili. I mean, when you eat actual Southwestern chili, it's a whole different animal than chili from New Jersey. Okay, plus the kidney beans. Ugh. Okay. But we also started to adapt to our new home, and we ate more citrus fruit because we were in an area that ate a lot of citrus fruit. We had a lot of lettuce, a lot of melons, because we were really the garden bowl, the salad bowl of Arizona in Yuma. And we ate tamales, rolled tacos, burritos. We ate Mexican food because we were right on the border with Mexico, and people would go from door to door selling food. And we learned to embrace Mexican food as well as keep some of what my parents had brought with them from New Jersey. So even in the same country, just being coast to coast, or, coast kind of inland to kind of inland, we share different types of food. And people will have debates over that all the time. In-N-Out versus Whataburger. That's one of the big debates that's going on between California and Texas, of all things. So when you move from one country to another, or even from one state to another state, you're going to see those differences. You're going to take some of your things with you, but you're going to adopt some of the new things from your new place of living. Okay. So when we're talking here, when people move from their home country to another nation, they take with them their language, food, and customs, but they also share that, and they also borrow from others. It isn't that they aren't committed to making a new life in their adopted country. It's just that they love their original homeland as well. It generally takes 3 generations for a family to become completely integrated in a new country. One of my favorite authors, not so much now, but definitely used to be, was Amy Tan. And her whole work was based on the conflict between a mom who had just moved to the United States from China and the daughters who were born in the United States. And so you had an immigrant from China versus the first generation born in the US, and the conflict that the two went through, because you have this desire to integrate and yet keep the old traditions as well. And it was difficult for both sides. And so her books are full of conflict and love at the same time. Okay, let's take this poem apart and really understand what Sir Walter Scott is trying to say. Okay, so he says, breathes there the man with soul so dead. Okay, so to breathe, we understand that means life, okay? But he's saying is there a man who can breathe, still breathe, but has a dead soul? Is there someone who is really like a walking dead man, a zombie, someone who can breathe, someone can locomotive, they can walk, but they have a dead soul? So breathes there the man with soul so dead. And he's actually asking a question, even though there's no question mark anywhere in this section. Who never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land. So he says, is there a man out there who can breathe, but has a dead soul, who has never said to himself, this is my own, my native land? He's asking a question, even though there's an exclamation point right there. So he's saying, is there a man that even exists who can not say, is there a man who exists who cannot say, this is my own, my native land? Everybody has a place that they call their own. That's what he's saying. Everybody has a place they can call their native land. Native meaning you were born into that land. Whose heart hath never within him burned. The idea that when you're away from your native land, from your homeland, your heart burns. It yearns to go back. Okay? As home his footsteps he hath turned. You always seem to want to go back. Okay, just recently I took a quick little road trip with Mr. S. It was just a one-day turnaround from Banning to Henderson and back again. And I love road trips. Mr. S knows this. We like getting in the car and just taking off. It's a lot of fun. But we traveled all the way to Henderson, and the scenery was beautiful. It was a gorgeous day. Got there, spent some time with family, and then turned around and came home. And again, the ride home was beautiful, gorgeous day. But by the time we're a couple of hours on the road, we're ready to be home. Not going to Henderson, but coming back, definitely. The closer you get to home, the more you want to get home. Now, you guys have all been, in this position when we've done field trips or games on the road, or we've spent some time at the school doing like youth rallies or whatever. And it's exciting to go to where we're going. And then on the way back, everybody kind of crashes and they start falling asleep in the back of the van. And then when we get to about Redlands, we always say, okay, everybody, it's time to get out your phones and call your parents and let them know we're on our way, where we are, and tell them to meet us at the church to pick you up. By that time, everybody in the van is really, really ready to go home. They're tired. They have to pee. They just want to go home, take a shower, crawl under a blanket, and just relax for a little bit, watch some TV, play a video game, read a book, and drift off to sleep. There is a point where you want to turn your footsteps home. And he's saying there's nobody who doesn't want to do that. Then he says, as home his footsteps he hath turned. He wants to go home from wandering on a foreign strand. He's like, you've wandered long enough. Now it's time to turn around and go home. A foreign strand would be a foreign beach. Okay, strand is a beach. And he talks about wandering. You don't really know where you're going. You're just kind of exploring, kind of looking around. If such there breathe, if such a person exists, that's what he's talking about. If such there breathe or lives or exists, go find that person. Mark him well. Means exactly what it says. Tag him, mark him, follow him, see how he's received by his own countrymen. That's what he's saying. There is a definite difference in this specific person. If such there breathe, go, mark him well, watch him, observe him, keep track of him. For him, no minstrel raptures swell. Nobody's singing songs about this guy. Why? Because he's kind of wandering. He doesn't really have a place. He doesn't have a place where he can stand in his own universe. You know that phrase, because when we are speaking about young adult literature, that is really the primary theme of most adult literature, finding your spot, your place where you stand in the universe. This guy doesn't have one. He has given up his home. He doesn't feel any kind of connection to his homeland. And as a result, there is nothing for him. The minstrels or the song singers, the lyricists, the songwriters, they don't have anything to write about him. Now we're going on. Turns out this guy can be even someone who has everything. High though his titles. It's like maybe this person is a king or prince or a duke or an earl, a viscount. Maybe this person has a high title. Maybe he has a name that he's proud of, a long line that he comes from. Boundless his wealth. Maybe he has more money than he knows what to do with. More than he could ever spend in 5 lifetimes. Boundless his wealth as wish could claim. He can spend his money anywhere. And then he says, despite those titles, power, and pelf would be money, the wretch, this guy could be titled, be a king, duke, prince. He could be proud. He can be wealthy, but he could also be a wretch, someone who doesn't quite fit in, someone who's sad, someone who's unhappy, someone who is frustrated with their life. They could be a wretch. They could be unhappy. Con-centered. Con-centered means within themselves. The idea that you're not just self-centered, you are self-centered. You're with self-centeredness. He's con-centered all in self. He doesn't even pay attention to where he is because all he thinks about is who he is, where he is, what it affects him as. Okay, he is concentered all in self. He's selfish. Living, even though he's alive, okay, he's breathing. He shall forfeit fair renown. Even though he's alive, even though he's breathing, if he has no native land that he is proud of, that feels important to him, that he misses, he shall forfeit fair renown. That means he will no longer be allowed or be, goodness, come on. I'm sorry, my brain kind of shuts down sometimes. He's forfeiting. That means he's giving up his fair renown, his good name, what he's known as. He shall give up his good name, and doubly dying, because he's dying to himself and to his name. He shall go down to the vile dust, meaning he will die and return to the dust from which he sprung. That's a biblical reference. From dust thou were made, to dust thou shalt return. And when he dies, he shall die unwept, because nobody really has any connection with him. He has given up his country, so they don't even know who he is. So nobody is there to weep for him. He is unhonored because he has not given anything else outside of himself for the honor of his country, and unsung. There's no reason to sing about this person because nobody knows about them. They are all so concentered in self that they have not touched anyone else's life. And it definitely doesn't have any impact on the country from which they come. Okay. So what does this have to do with imagery? Let's talk about it. Talking about breathing, the feeling of breath entering and leaving the body. The idea of breathing is also often used to talk about the soul when someone dies and they give their final breath, and we talk about the soul exiting their body. It's not just the breath that we're talking about leaving, we're talking about the soul leaving. So even if there's a man who breathes, he could have a soul that is dead. And when you breathe in and out, you can feel that in your chest. You can feel your lungs expanding, your ribs expanding to take in all that air and then breathe it out. And who never to his man himself has said, there is my own, my native land. The idea of that heart longing for your native country, the feeling of wandering, that tiredness, the sore feet, the muscles burning as the lactic acid, builds up as you walk and you start to burn and you decide you want to go home and rest and put your feet up and just kind of relax in your native land. We talk about the minstrel's music swelling. We can almost hear the celebration music coming as this person comes back into town, or they should be doing that. except for this person has been so concentered. And even though his title is Proud Name, Boundless Wealth, that idea of feeling that comfort from wealth, and yet when you're concentered, when you're all about yourself, you forfeit all the good things that could come about you. And then doubly dying, go down to the vile dust, and there's death, that emptiness. Okay. It's not the greatest for imagery, but it's a tough one. And I wanted to kind of get it in here and try to bring imagery in on a hard poem first before we talk about it in a poem that's a little more lighthearted. Okay, let's do it one more time. We understand now what this poem is all about. Let's do it one more time. I'm going to make this our only real poem today because we spent a little bit of time talking about imagery. You're going to do the homework and you will understand exactly what you're doing the homework on. Just make sure you read every single question and the answer choices. Okay, too many of you are choosing just one answer when there should be 2 or 3 because you're not reading every single choice. Also, don't assume that it's every single choice. Read them carefully and use your critical thinking skills, please. Okay, one last time, My Native Land, and then we'll wrap it up for today. My Native Land, Sir Walter Scott. Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, This is my own, my native land, whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand. If such there breathe, go, mark him well, for him no minstrel raptures swell. High though his titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth as wish can claim, despite those titles, power and pelf, the wretch, concentred all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead and look over the poem, look over the notes, look over your homework, read carefully, use your critical thinking skills, give me your absolute best work, but more importantly, give yourself your best work. And I will see you again on Thursday. Goodbye.